Thank you. Hello and welcome back, everyone. Before we move further, I would like to cover a few housekeeping topics. Today's sessions are being recorded. You will be able to view them on our YouTube channel. You can find us under the name of Access Development Services. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it further. Secondly, we also invite your comments and questions. Please take a look at the Q&A chat box on your screens. If you think of a question for the speakers at any point, you can type it in there and we will hold it for the discussion portion at the end of the session. I welcome you to the summit's second plenary, plotting the contours of India's 12 crore livelihoods in the coming decade. For a country like India, the level of employment is inadequate for the growing population. The economy needs to grow and grow in a manner that generates livelihoods. Given that there will be an increase in the labor force by 2030 and therefore the need to generate 12 crore new livelihoods in the 2021-2030 decade to ensure near full employment for its labor force by 2030, the need of the hour is to move away from jobless growth to a jobful growth in the coming decade. Today, we are joined by an extremely distinguished panel. I am extremely privileged to introduce Mr. Vijay Mahajan, our moderator. Mr. Mahajan founded Pradhan in 1983 and Basic Social Enterprise Group in 1991. Basics has supported 5 million poor households through microfinance and livelihood promotion services. Mr. Mahajan also serves on numerous policy committees and social enterprise boards. Amongst our panelists, we have Dr. Shubhashish Gangopadhyay, Dean, the Indian School of Public Policy, and founder and research director at the Indian Development Foundation. Dr. Ashok Khosla, Chairman, Development Alternatives Group, and Dr. Smita Premchanda, Secretary at Sampark. Welcome, everyone. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Vijay Mahajan. Sir, the floor is all yours.
I wish I could see the audience as well. Is there a way for you to turn the camera on them for just 1 second or no? No. you don't capture the audience with this. Okay, anyway, we'll wait for Zoom too. But namaskar everybody in the audience. And certainly thank you to the entire Access team for arranging this event relentlessly every year, even in the COVID years. They organized it. It's an amazing Apex event, and actually the two events, the Inclusive Finance Summit, which just got over yesterday, and then the Livelihood Summit. And for me personally, it is very gratifying that we are moving from finance to livelihood, because as if nowhere else, at least last year, it became clear that the only purpose of finance could be to improve human well-being. I have a very distinguished panel in front of me. The doyen of the Indian environment and development movement, Ashok Khosla, who established Development Alternatives after leaving his job at the United Nations Environment Program. And he is still very, very active, despite having celebrated his 80th birthday 2 years ago. I was present on 31st March 2020 when it happened, just at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And we have Shubhashish Gangopadhyay. I would like to say he's a celebrated economist, but the celebrations have been quiet by people like me. Shubhashish tends to stay away from the limelight, but he is truly one of our really incisive economic minds, and manages to capture his understanding of the macroeconomy, but translate it like a true Bengali into what it means to in human terms. And I will, of course, ask Shubhashish some questions on that front. And then, of course, I'm delighted to invite Smita, with whom I overlapped for a year way back in 1980 in IIM Ahmedabad. I was a year your senior, Smita, I remember that, always. So Smita is not just very centrally involved with the development movement, particularly with an emphasis on livelihoods for women, but she was also a fellow contributor to the last year's State of India's Livelihood Environment, State of India's Livelihood report. And I'm delighted that she'll be participating in this. Now, let me move straight to the topic. The number 12 crores livelihoods is based on computations that I did, and certainly if anybody wants to look at those computations, I'd be happy to share the calculations. But the issue is not whether it's 12 crores or whether it is 10 and a half or 13 and a half. The fact is, we need roughly 1 crore or more livelihoods every year in this decade if we have to reach at the end of the decade at a situation where we have near full employment. When I say near full employment, I assume that there will be a structural residual unemployment of about 3%, because no economy is 100% full employment. So to cover the backlog of unemployed people, as well as to cover the increments in the Indian labor force, we have to generate a very large number of livelihoods. So I request you not to focus on the technical correctness of the number. Let's say 1 crore rounded off this way, that way. But that's a huge number. And let me just put it in perspective. You know, in our glorious growth years, 2004 to 2011-12, and in both of those years, we have the National Sample Survey data for monthly per capita expenditure, due to which we could measure the per capita incomes and the poverty ratio, as well as we had the unemployment and employment surveys in the same years. So in those 2 years, 2004-5 to 2011-12, first of all, we had a GDP compounded annual growth rate of exceeding 8%. And that led to a situation where we were able to, I'm just giving the exact numbers, the number of poor, the absolute number of poor in India came down from 30.2 crore, 302 million, to 16.3 crore, a reduction of full 46%. Effectively, poverty nearly halved as a result not just of growth, but growth in the right places. That is, growth moved from rural to urban areas and from the agricultural sector to the non-farm sector. So due to that, employment grew, and due to that, incomes grew, and that's how poverty fell dramatically, because a lot of people moved out of agriculture to the non-farm sector, both in rural and the urban areas. However, in the following 7-year period, that is 2012-13 to 2019-20, which stops just before COVID started, we saw a decline in GDP growth rate from above 8% CAGR to below 6% CAGR. And indeed, in the last year, just before COVID set in, the growth rate had fallen to below 5%. As a result, the unemployment shot up to a record 6.1% as per PLFS data 2017-18. And that was a historic high of 45 years. Never since 1973, the oil shock year, did the Indian economy register an unemployment rate that high. And this is official Labor Ministry data. I'm not giving any data which is not official in this conversation. And then, of course, there was COVID. And that year, the year 21, was personally tragic for me, or at least a year of setback. Not only did I fall prey to COVID and I was hospitalized for a whole month, thankfully I've fully recovered. But what is dear to me, the Indian economy really suffered. We had a decline in GDP growth. Basically, we had a decline in GDP, not GDP growth. And that was nearly negative 9%. And what's notable is that while every economy in the world declined, the Indian economy suffered among the highest in the among the large economies of the world. As a result, unemployment peaked to 4.8 crores, which was 9.2% of the workforce, of the labor force, at the end of December 2020. That is the end of the first wave. Youth unemployment shot up to 15%, roughly 1 in 6. And in Uttar Pradesh, just to further zoom down, youth unemployment shot up to 36% among educated youth and 63% among women who had studied school or higher than school, diploma holders or graduates or postgraduates. So 2 out of 3 women, even if they managed to study, did not get jobs in UP in that. So as a result, for the first time, and this is what is personally tragic for me, because all my life since I finished IIT, I've worked to help reduce poverty in this country, and we had seen the glorious years up to 2012. And now in this year, the poverty shot up to 34.6 crores, a devastating increase of 18.3 crores. So we now have a dual problem, my dear panelists. Not only do we have to generate those 12 crore new livelihoods, but we have to fix livelihoods for maybe another 12 crores, because though they are working, they are below the poverty line. So we have this problem of what's called the working poor. It's not just unemployment, the working poor of India. So we have a historic, huge problem in our hands. And this is, according to me, the single most important problem that the Indian polity, the Indian economy, and the Indian society has to address itself. So let me begin by asking Subhashish. First of all, Subhashish, without getting technical, I've already quoted a lot of numbers. Do you broadly agree with my assessment? And if you do or don't, in any case, what is your suggestion for, linking the two things, while simultaneously having growth in the economy, but ensuring that that growth is inclusive and beneficial for human beings rather than for physical things like infrastructure or intangible things like financial capital? I'll begin with Subhashish, then I'll come to Ashok and then Smita, and then we'll do 3 or 4 rounds of round robin questions. So I request you to be brief in your responses, because I'll come 3 or 4 times to you.
Thank you, Vijay. Very quickly, I'll refer to something that I read in the newspapers today. There was a news that in Haryana, there is a college for women, which has 303 students and 1 teacher. And the teacher had dengue, and so the college had to shut down. Now, this immediately tells me that we are building roads on which cars can travel. We are cutting off people from one side of the road to the other side of the road. So this sort of growth and development, when we cannot have teachers in colleges, we cannot have inclusive growth, regardless of whether it is 6 crore or 12 crores. So to have inclusive growth, we have to understand that India has the lowest number of people among most countries who are paid for by the government. We don't have doctors, we don't have teachers. We are only looking at development through helping businesses. So we have to worry about helping people to find jobs. So we have to focus on the citizen. We have to focus on the young generation that is coming up, how to train them to be able to do the jobs that they can do, because we don't know how the job market is going to evolve. The whole world is changing. So for me, the important thing is to focus on the basic necessities that the government is supposed to provide in health, education, law and order, etc. That immediately creates millions of jobs, because we are highly under provision when it comes to people working in these areas. That would be my first thought. And then, we can talk about it later.
Thank you, Subhashish. Ashok, you had at least a 50-year view of the Indian growth scenario. From the time you sort of came, you were actually probably one of the speech writers, if not the speech writer for Indira Gandhi's famous speech at the Stockholm Environment Summit. So that's like early 70s. And since then, you've occupied policy positions in government and then seen the economy both from the top, but also through your field work from the bottom. Do you agree that we are at a historical crisis? And what are your suggestions to deal with it?
Absolutely. Vijay, what Subhashish just said is absolutely true. What you introduced in terms of the background information, and in fact, the note that you so valiantly put together. I mean, it's a tour de force, which he's showing on the screen, which is 56 pages of totally condensed wham at society. I mean, the numbers you talk about, Vijay, are actually probably on the optimistic side. I think things are worse than what you said on almost every front. If you talk about my own engagement with these issues, which goes back to before I left graduate school to come back to India, but certainly 1971, when I started working in the government on putting together an environmental agency, I have to say that I thought things were at a crisis mode at that time, and it's only got worse. In 1980, in the early 80s, when you and I and several other people were putting together civil society activity to deal with these issues, it was a crisis that brought us to these issues already. And it was a job crisis. The mission of the organization I set up in 1982 was to create sustainable livelihoods. That was the mission of an organization whose vision was to leave no one behind. In those explicit terms, it was not just a simple Gandhian mission, vision of India and a mission for an organization, but in a technological world, even more poignant, if you like, because of all the opportunities, all the possibilities of making every single person in our country and maybe around the world live decent, fulfilling, happy lives. Human well-being has never been at the center of government policy, and unfortunately that shows. And as you say, we had some degree of improvement during the early part of the 21st century, but then everything started collapsing, and it's not really a good scene. I would certainly say that the numbers are probably worse. Numbers are higher, bigger in terms of the goals that we need to meet by 1930, 1940, 1947, 2047. When we're 100 years old, we will look back on our lives and say we really failed miserably unless we do substantially better. Your identification of the dogs and the gods, I think, is very, very important. And I think everybody should read your report because it identifies the systemic nature of the issue, the systemic lack of connections between the different dots that we need to connect. I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but all I can say is that unless we understand that technology, economics, the issue of markets, management, all these things come together in order to make the kinds of jobs and livelihoods that we're talking about, then we will fail. And unfortunately, though Indian culture seems to be very systemic in its thinking, our governance mechanisms are totally simplistic. They're siloed, they're almost impossible to coordinate among even ministries, let alone among different sectors. So I would suggest that we look somewhat more deeply into the problems you've identified in your report and take them forward. All civil society organizations and hopefully business is going to have to come together to see these things in a very practical, systematic way. Thanks.
Thank you, Ashok. Before I come to you, Smita, let me just, for the benefit of the audience who may not, all of whom may not have read the document. So the dogs and the gods that Ashok refers to, chapter 2 is called What Dogs India's Livelihoods. And given my penchant for acronyms, DOGS, D stands for demographic disappointment. That is, the demographic dividend was declared but not paid. O stands for occupational aspirations, which sadly still remains first, government job, second, any salaried job, third, at least a casual salaried job, and fourth, if not that, then self-employment. So self-employment is Majburi ka naam, Atmanirbhar. Third, the G is the geographic mismatch. The workers live in Bharat, the jobs are in India, at least for the last 10 years. And finally, the S is the sectoral and firm level perverse incentives which discourage employing labor. We are among the most highly automated manufacturing economies in the world. We talked very proudly about the use of AI and machine learning and robotics, as if people were not around in this landmass. Those technologies were required in countries where there's a severe shortage of labor, where the minimum wage rate is $6 an hour. Not here. And as far as the gods are concerned, that is some of the solutions. G stands for greening of India to generate sustainable livelihoods. O stands for opportunities of new skilled jobs in high growth sectors. D stands for digital services livelihoods, particularly for Gen Next and women, which is where I want Smita you to focus on. And S stands for spatial redistribution of livelihoods. Not rural versus urban. We should get away from that paradigm, but we should look at the 5,000 towns in this country, census towns. We have 700 district headquarters and roughly another 7 or 8 town-sized habitations in every district. So those 5,000 growth centers should be the new places where jobs get created. With that, Smita, may I request you to come in and let's focus on the solutions. I think we've focused enough on the problem. Thanks.
Thank you, Vijay. I think I need to say, of course, thanks to you for chairing this. And last year also, we contributed a chapter to the report of soil, but also thanks to Access, because they continued the thinking that we had put into last year's report also in this year. And I think the important issue that me and my team were looking at, we were looking at women's livelihoods and basically looking at how women are in fact unequal citizens still. So even if you're looking at employment, you're looking at, women in the agricultural sector are all in informal employment, but even in the non-agricultural sector, 84.7% of the women are in informal employment, even in the non-agri sector. Their wages are way less than men for equal work, equal types of work. But more importantly, most of the women, even in official work, are actually informal workers in formal sector. So if you look at Anganwadi workers or you look at Asha workers, they are in fact informal in the formal sector. So not only do we fail to recognize women's work in our GDP, women's unpaid work, but that inequality or that taken for granted unpaid women's work in the households gets transferred to the society and to the economy. Only in one state did this exercise get done as to how much women contribute to the GDP. And in Meghalaya, they found that the GDP would go up by 49% if women's unpaid work was counted. That exercise has not happened and remains to happen in the rest of the country. And there is a demand for that. So what we did was that we analyzed access to education and services for women, voice, influence and agency for women. All these things affect their equality in the labor market and so on. But we also looked at and identified norms, social norms, institutional norms as a very important constraint, and that remains a very important constraint. This year we came to analyzing informal work for ASHA workers, Anganwadi workers, domestic workers and construction workers, and we find that it's really important for their work to be counted, number one, and for their work to be formal. I can expand on this a little bit later, but let me hand over to Vijay now so that details can come later. Thank you, Vijay.
Thank you, Smita, particularly for highlighting the uncounted, accounted contribution of women to not just the economy but to human well-being. If economics was ever redesigned to take into account that all that matters, which is human welfare, then I think the contribution would be even higher than the 46% that you mentioned. Subhashish, it is a sine qua non that unless there's economic growth, we cannot, really do away with poverty as well as with, unemployment. That is granted. I think that is an arid debate, growth versus distribution. But indeed, for an economy of India's size, hoping to become a $5 trillion economy at some stage, and more than 1.3 billion people, can we really not strive for an economic model which is homegrown, just as the Chinese model was homegrown, not copied from anywhere else? An economic model which simultaneously takes care of a large number of our rural and agricultural and informal sector workers, giving them a decent living wage, and yet collectively generates a reasonably high growth rate, typically 8%. And for me, it's a mystery, Subhashish, because every micro enterprise that I've worked with in my life shows an annual growth rate of double digit ever since I've ever met them. They show financial rates of return which are embarrassing. So why is it that we say, oh, our economy is suffering because it is full of informal sector? If we formalize, we will grow more faster. That's not true. Actually, it's the informal sector which is growing faster. Do we have a measurement problem, or do we have a bias against the lower half of the economy?
There were a lot of questions that you asked. Let me see if I can distill them all into one answer. The first thing is that, let me go backwards. This distinction between informal and formal, only to me is only applicable when we talk about employment or livelihood security, right? And the exploitation of labor. Other than that, these are all economic activities, and probably the micro enterprises that you're talking about, there is greater degree of control and cohesion in what they're doing. So I am not surprised by the fact that they would have higher growth rates to begin with. The question is, can they be scaled up? And once they're scaled up, they enter the formal sector. Indeed, if you look at any country of the world, the employment growth and the GDP growth is not maintained by the large companies. It is maintained by the smaller companies. because they take in new labor, they take in new types of training, and then, drive the economy forward. And the culmination comes with the high growth, the large sectors. So in that sense, I would agree with you that there's probably a bias against taking the informal sector seriously, and especially among academic economists. Yes, you're right. But this bias, I presume, would go away because as society is transforming, technology is, digital and digitization, and then digitalization is completely changing the way labor is organized in economic activities, right? And so there will be a lot of blurring that will take place between what is the formal sector and what is the informal sector, especially when it comes to labor. The other thing that you said is, what do we need to do if we look at, for me, I can immediately think of some areas where the government needs to focus on. And then there are obvious choices, maybe with a few new ones. Health, education, urbanization. You talked about the tier 2 cities, right? That's where all economic activity should be taking place. And in fact, you talked about the rural-urban approach. If we look at the data that you were referring to, there are two things that stand out. One is that the average age of the so-called cultivator is increasing over time in a country that is this young, which essentially suggests that the young people do not want to be in agriculture. And the second thing is that if you keep looking at agriculture, agriculture is simply not viable at the levels that we are doing it. So we need to grow non-farm activities. We keep talking about it, and we always try to start the non-farm activity from the agricultural sector. I think we need to take a big jump and say, okay, let's focus economic activity in the cities. And let's see how many people can be drawn out from the rural sector. In fact, the second thing I want to say is that if you look at the rural or the so-called rural areas close to our cities, you'll find that many of the urban activities are actually happening in the rural areas. Tractor, all, even car mechanics are there in rural areas. Well, because they have the space in which to grow and develop. So all of these is suggesting what you said, that there should be urbanization. So health, education, environment, urbanization, and something that is citizen security. I keep talking about this, that we employ, I did some calculations some time ago. In India, 2.3% of the population get a salary directly or indirectly from the various governments, right? Be it center, be it state, be it third tier. In the US, after Reagan, it was 8%. And in Europe, especially the Northern European countries, it's more like 14%, 17%, etc. We always complain about the government being in your face all the time. Unfortunately, the government is not where it should be. And that is what I mean. It is the human capital that will drive everything. We forget that our biggest resource is human capital, and we are not allowing it to grow. And that, by the way, Vijay, is where the formal-informal labor market thing comes in, because it is easier to grow human capital in the formal labor market because you have some, stability of employment, and human capital cannot grow with infrastructure, finance, or anything. It has to be the time and commitment of the human capitalist himself or herself. It is essential. And that will not happen unless there is stability in employment. So that's the connect, I feel, between formalization and informal labor markets.
Thank you, Subhashis. As usual, you made a convincing argument for the simultaneity of, while a large part of the employment will remain in the informal sector, but there are some virtues of the larger and the formal sector, and you enumerated them. But let me go back to a point that you made about agriculture, and let me ask Ashok. Ashok, the Indian agricultural sector as a share of the GDP, of course, is now, quite low. It's about 1/6, 15-16% of GDP. And in terms of share of employment also, it has come down below 50%. In fact, if we go by the time disposition of rural households, then so-called farmers are actually non-farmers. If you see over the year what they do to earn a living, many people who are reported as cultivators as their main occupation are actually non-farmers. They make more income through construction work, through urban migration, or through some non-farm activity which they may locally be doing. But I still want to make a pitch for agriculture, and not so much agriculture, but for the natural resource base of the nation, Jal, Jungle, Zameen, water, forests and land. And as you know, our economy will go nowhere unless our environment is conserved. And our environment is now seriously, in trouble, because over the last 50 to 70 years, we've exploited these three resources, Jal, Jungle, Zameen, to the point where they are now creaking. Even in Punjab, there are severe problems of groundwater, there are problems in soil quality. Delhi air, we need not talk about. Most states have at least half the districts which are red zone as far as groundwater availability is concerned. Most of our rivers are polluted. Forests, of course, all the data, what's happening, and with the new forest amendment bill, it might even become worse. So I have argued in this report that India actually needs to, for the next 10 years, commit itself to a major investment, roughly 2% of the GDP, in regenerating the natural resources, Jal, Jungle, Zameen. And the other virtue of this is that not only will it restore the environment and the productive basis of rural India, but it will provide employment where the people are. There are a large number of people in rural India who are unemployed and who are basically not very skilled, or not skilled enough to immediately go and work in the urban other sector markets. Even if they go to urban areas, they work as hamalis, they work as manual laborers, etc., etc. So may I ask you to say a little more about this strategy? Do you agree, or do you want to improve on it?
Well, Vijay, you've more or less answered all the questions yourself. The fact is, let me just go back 1 second to the whole issue of formal and informal. In a sense, what we manage depends on what we measure, and the informal sector is unmeasurable. It's very difficult. And the reason that economists and policymakers love to think of formalizing the informal sector is because they become taxable. They become amenable to supporting the aspirations of the rich in a way that they don't if they're very far away and outside the economy. The fact is that a very large distinction between formal and informal lies in perception of something that is good and systematic and so on, and that's something that is chaotic and local and unmanageable. But that's not so. In fact, a very large part of the future of India depends on local economies, local community-based businesses and so on, which I think, in a sense, have to transcend the distinction between formality and informality. So I would certainly like to think that we've got to change our frame of reference in looking at the economics of job creation and of basic needs fulfillment. It's the two sides of the same coin. Creating incomes, creating goods and services that people need in their day-to-day lives for their well-being. And that includes education and healthcare, of course, but it includes shelter and food and clothing. I was at a meeting yesterday with Anshu Gupta of Gunj, and he very convincingly showed how important clothing is and how many people actually die of cold in this country because of lack of clothing. I mean, it was quite dramatic, the insights that we don't think about as being fundamental in human well-being. So I think the future of India does lie in feeding itself, which means it has to have farming, and that farming has to depend much more on nature than it does on chemicals and energy and mechanical devices. But you have to recognize that no activity, whether it's on land or in the factory, can be of value to larger numbers of people unless it's got a certain amount of technological basis to improve productivity. Unless you're an artist or a poet or a musician or something, living with all you can do with your hands and your brains is not likely to be generating surpluses enough for the society. Whether you are in a factory or on the farm, you do need technology. The question is what kind of technology? And what you were referring to earlier is technology that essentially displaces labor in inordinate amounts. What we're looking for is frugal technology, technology that actually, for example, the building behind me, the headquarters of my organization, is made of technologies that nurture not only better use of nature, less waste, but create large numbers of jobs at the same time. So it seems to me that we've got to rethink the relationship between technology, labor and people, and finance. And this comes from a totally different approach to what we consider a better future. This building is elegant enough that even embassies want to rent space in it, but it is made out of natural materials, and has generated a lot of interest because it was the cause of about 55 to 60% less carbon emissions, much less energy, much less use of virgin materials, and makes a very big difference. So we need similar approaches in our farming and in fulfillment of all our needs, whether it's textiles and clothes, whether it's shelter, whether it's energy, whether it's household cooking, whatever. We need to find ways, and we have them, that are fulfilling and are in consonance with nature. So what you said about investing in our natural assets is crucial. The only thing is, I think you've underestimated it. I believe you've got to invest maybe much more than 2% in human capital, in human beings, and in nature.
No, I was only talking about Jal Jangal Zameen.
Yes.
The 3% in health and 6% in education.
When you add all that up, it's good. It's good money.
Yes, 11-12%.
Yeah.
So let me, Smita, let me ask you the last question. And in the meantime, I request the organizers to start putting audience questions on the chat box or whichever way they want me to handle some of those. But Smita, in the last chapter of this is again a set of suggestions which I call the eightfold path to sustainable livelihoods for all by 2030. The first of that is transform agriculture from subsistence to sustainability, what Ashok just talked about, and practice the 3 R's of greening of India, reduce, reuse, and recycle, the 3 R's. But, and Shubhashish already talked about, health and education. So, and I have added to it skill and entrepreneurship training as the, the education shouldn't just end with this 10th or 12th standard or a BA, but it should enable people to earn a living and to finance the trajectory of inclusive livelihood using multiple sources. That is really my own bugbear. I believe that depending on the government to kickstart the Indian economy is a bum's game. It's time we just started looking at where all the money is. And the money is with the households. It's, of course, not sitting in their own trunks. It is lying in bank accounts. During this COVID crisis, while the government had a hard time increasing the expenditure by even 2 lakh crores, in that same period, when the RBI on March 30th, 2020 reduced the SLR and increased bank liquidity in various ways, that evening, at 12:30, the governor announced reduction in SLR. That evening, 7 lakh crores came back from the banking system to the RBI because the banks were not willing to lend it. The banks were flush with deposits from households. Households were giving it to the banks were putting it back to the RBI. So we are stuck in a situation where the money is getting accumulated in a system, and you know that very well, Smita, working with micro entrepreneurs, so many places. our banking system was nationalized, was mandated to lend to the poor, or at least since Mudra lent to the entrepreneurial poor or not so poor. But look at what it has done in terms of either access to capital to that category of people or in terms of growth. Your comments, please. And then we'll go to the audience questions.
Thank you, Vijay. I think since you bring me to entrepreneurship, but let me just start one step before, especially because I was talking about women, right? So we are saying women's access to education is problematic. The entire effort of the government has been to make the school structure more efficient, which means that they've clubbed schools, they've closed a lot of schools, and girls who are going into puberty, they cannot reach schools, and because they are unsafe on the roads. And this means that as you go up the education ladder, then women's education really falls by the time you come to college. The gender gap increases. You go from here to skill training, you find our cities are educating, girls are only 33% of the youth which are trained in the rural self-employment training centers. Now you come to finance and work. I already told you, feminized work is hugely kept informal, and an examination that we did on the basis of the decent work lens of which is used by the ILO, we found that on all 4 criteria, whether it's wages or working conditions or social dialogue or social protection, women's informal work has huge disadvantages, decent work deficits, much more than men's informal work. I'll come now specifically to your question on entrepreneurship. We just completed a study for Access, actually, which was talking about access of women to finance, because a lot of them are relegated to income generating activities and self-employment in the absence of employment. And we found, whether it's Mudra or anything else, basically women owned enterprises in this country are less than 20%. If you look at just Mudra, for the very small loans, the Shishu loans, women get 66%, so they are 2/3. You grow further to Kishore loans, women's portion falls to 25. You go to Tarun loans, which are more than 500,000, so 5 lakhs of loan, and women's portion remains 3%. So this country, even if they are willing to give 112 SHG, women in SHGs, 112 lakh SHGs here, you're willing to give them loans of 50,000 and less. The average is less than 25,000. But the moment businesses start growing, there is no finance for them. SHG to individual, no finance for them. Because, and I'm coming back again to the same thing, it's in our heads. In our heads that women should look after the family, not men. Men spend 25 minutes a day in house care and other care. Women spend 4 hours. This is the time use allocation studies that have come out in India. And so in our heads, women will always do housework. The moment you're talking of businesses, that will be taken care of by men. So even formal financial institutions think that, as long as it's social collateral, as long as it's 50,000 small IGAs, we can give the money. But the moment you go forward, the suspicion is this is not being managed by the woman. So even if she's a good repayer for the small loan, she will not be a good repayer for the large loan, because the large loan is going to be managed by the man. So the entire disciplining and repayment confidence that is there for small loans doesn't really go forward. And these are very big blocks for, formal finance, just for women. For men also, there are similar blocks.
True. Thank you so much, Smita. Yeah. Now, let me just open up to some of the audience questions and direct the first question to Subhashish. This is from Dr. Sant Kumar Prasad of Xavier Institute of Science, Social Service in Ranchi. He's asking, how long will the agricultural sector in Eastern India be ignored? How can it be improved? Subhashish?
Well, I don't know. I think we have to go down to the basic facts, right? Much of Eastern India at one time was doing great, not because of its agriculture, but because of its non-agricultural activities, chemicals factories, heavy industries, the port, supplying the hinterland. So all of that was happening in Eastern India. So that's fact number one. Fact number two, if we improve agriculture, I presume one would say that we increase productivity. Any data that I see, any analysis that I do, I find that when it comes to agriculture, we have to think what sort of agriculture. If we just improve productivity, we'll end up like what has happened in Punjab and Haryana. We are growing rice and wheat, which people do not want to consume that much, right? So we have to have MSP and all the associated problems that come up with it. So if we want to improve agriculture in Eastern India, we have to first figure out what sort of agriculture. Because you do not want the whole thing to start all over again. And given the demand situation, if you produce more food, the prices are going to crash. And that does not give greater income, it actually gives lesser income. And that is what we have been seeing over the last 15, 20, 30 years. And yet we don't want to see it. And this was something that was said by Ambedkar in 1918. That is 103 years ago. That exactly this thing will happen if we continue to improve productivity in agriculture without wondering about how many people are associated in agriculture. So I think more than improving, the only way to improve the agricultural sector in the eastern part of India is to focus outside of agriculture, not on agriculture.
Great. So it reminds me of the conclusion of my rural non-farm sector study in mid-90s, where I had come to the conclusion, the opposite one, which is that to have a robust non-farm sector in any state, you first needed a robust farm sector because it generated both the economic surpluses as well as the material surpluses for you to process further. But I agree with you that we have agricultural growth in India. If it has to come back, particularly in the eastern region, it has to be demand side first. And indeed, what was practiced in West Bengal, in all of Bengal, the United Bengal, was multiple agriculture. There was a small paddy field, there was fishery, there was, lots of body level horticulture. And, it was both sustainable and there was no demand crises, So perhaps that's where we need to go with some market linkages. But let me take the next question from the audience, which I direct to Ashok. Ashok, somebody has pointed out, there's no name, but they pointed out that your point of sustainable and inclusive technology is absolutely important. But how can this reflect in our policies? Because without appropriate policies, this will only remain an idea.
Yeah, well, I'd like to answer that together with the point that Smita was making a little earlier. What you don't define, what you don't name, and what you don't measure doesn't get managed. And unfortunately, this is true in the case of finance. What she was describing at the lower end, what used to be called microfinance, which is really household industries, small industries, self-help groups, has now been expanded by the government's new definitions to being industries with 1 crore assets. Now, I mean, that's ridiculous. To tell you the truth, already 20 years ago, since the beginning of time, the most crucial sector that is good for jobs as well as for local basic needs is what I would call the mini sector, which is a bit above the micro and below the small. In other words, the 1 to 5 person business is what I would call the micro, but the one with 5 to 100 people is not micro and it's not small. It's called mini. I would give it a new name. It used to be called tiny in the Planning Commission about 30 years ago, but it got forgotten. And what she was pointing out is that that is the sector that is the most important in the whole economy. It creates the most jobs. It creates, and it's probably the best repayment sector as well, because the people in that sector are based in the community and usually can't run away from their debts. So essentially, we've not got a sector that we really need to deal most with, which is the one she was describing in terms of the various SIDB categorizations. And that is really what we need. Now, the same applies to technology. The frugal technologies don't exist in people's minds because basically we only think of space age, IT, big stuff that is relevant to, and in the meeting a few minutes ago with the finance minister, that was what they were talking about. AI, basically 5G, big technologies for airports and construction of infrastructure. And what basically is needed by those mini enterprises is technologies of the order of, investment of somewhere between 5 lakhs and a crore. And that is missing. Now, whether there is enough innovation going on in that area or not is very easy to answer. No, there isn't. None of the IITs are interested in that basic. None of the CSIR labs work on that area. A few little things, snippets, which they like to tell in their annual reports about making a Donapata machine or a few other things. But basically, there is no money and no attention to the kinds of technologies that are needed. And that is why, for example, my organization and yours, your past ones, Pradhan and Basics, were concerned with this segment, which is actually in the hundreds of millions. And the businesses are really the backbone of India. And they do not have access to the kinds of technology. The technology that you need for stopping crop burning, for example, to be able to convert crop wastes into usable products, whether it's charcoal, whether it's briquettes or whatever it is. Those are technologies that need a little bit of support in terms of innovation, and the Ministry of Science and Technology is aware of this, but the amount of money the government allows the Ministry of Science and Technology to put into this is minuscule. The finance advisor will stop them from doing anything unless it's space age, and so essentially our mindset is that this is jugaad, it's not worth dealing with, but it's not. Frugal technologies are the future for India, and they raise the productivity by a factor of 4, 5, 10, and they are enough to be competitive, much more better than competitive in comparison with large products, the products of large-scale industry.
Great. Thank you, Ashok. There is one more audience question, and I'll ask Smita to answer that. The question is, could the panel kindly comment on the performance of the various state-led MSME schemes and the ecosystem itself? And Smita, before you sort of answer that, because you already covered some detail about Mudra, which is the government's flagship credit scheme for MSME. But there's another, you focus mainly on Mudra and women, but I want to give you some data on Mudra in totality. This is based on a Government of India sample survey covering 97,000 Mudra borrowers. This was done in 17-18, and it showed that only 1 out of 5, 20.6% of Mudra borrowers use the loan for starting a new business. The remaining 80% use the money for existing businesses. Okay. And the employment generation was even more disappointing. Only 10% of the total loans generated any additional employment. So, and the reason is, because the vast number of loans are basically in the Shishu category, as you said, below 50,000, and the average loan size there is 27,000 rupees. And that is barely enough for household-based self-employment. It does not generate additional employment, least of all a living wage employment. So, we are fooling ourselves by saying कि मुद्रा में हमने 22 करोड़ लोन दे दिए और 12 लाख करोड़ रुपया पैसा दे दिया, इससे तो 25 करोड़ नौकरियां हो गई. This is all completely incorrect. It's even government's own data does not show it. So your comments, Smita.
Thank you, Vijay. That's a great.
We lost you.
We lost Smita. Smita, can you hear us?
Okay, till she comes back, maybe Subhashish, can you speak a bit about the MSME ecosystem?
You're muted. Shubhashish, you're muted. Yeah.
The mudra thing that you said is absolutely.
Am I audible?
That she's back. Thanks,
Okay.
Smita. Thanks, Smita, for saving me.
There's always a surprise quiz with
My
Mr. Margin, so you're not let out yet. Smita, go ahead. Well, I was ominously correct.
No, she's on.
Subhashish, you go ahead. We'll get Smita in when she...
No, Smita is there. Smita? No, she's talking.
She's having an audio problem, so you go ahead.
So what I was saying is that you're right in pointing to this fact. It is because, something that Ashok just said, because of the way we look at things, right? We treat them as separate things. We do not see that this is the life cycle of a business, right? That you go from small to your stable level. And that's the technology that you're looking for, which maintains that stability. Not everybody has to be, a business that grows up to employ 100,000 people, right? The technology is such that the optimality is probably reached around 50, 60, or even 100 people. And you have to consider that entire cycle. You can't break it up into and we have this in the so-called formal world, right? Relationship, banking, going back. And why don't we do that at the lower levels also? So the moment we categorize them into these things, something that was evident in almost all the people that were speaking, that if you categorize it in certain ways, then that's where the focus falls and it becomes like silos within this category.
Yeah.
The fact that there is a natural progression across these categories, that is something we have to understand and treat it the same way that we treat the formal sector.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Smita, are you back with your audio?
Yes, thank
Go
you.
ahead. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that the question from the audience was about MSME schemes, and we studied these schemes very recently for Access, and we found that you can categorize them into three. So you have direct financing schemes, then you have refinancing like Mudra, or you have credit guarantee schemes, and then you have non-financial services. And we find that if you look at just the direct financing schemes, the numbers are so many and all the figures are online, but you don't know, you cannot figure out from this the authenticity or anything. Even if you look at the refinance schemes like Mudra, we've spoken a lot about Mudra, this money was already being given by NBFCs to women entrepreneurs, whether for working capital and expanding their own business and so on. And so it's no surprise, Vijay, that you find only 1% new ones. Yeah. And in any case, these are all enterprises which were already
20%.
Financed. 20%. Okay. So the thing is that these are not new. So what you find on schemes, it's very difficult to judge whether these schemes are effective and what value they are adding on the total. Never mind women and men, that disaggregation is not there except in 3 or 4 schemes. Right? Even when you look at the credit guarantee fund, there is a disaggregation among women and men. But again, like credit guarantee fund seems to hold promise. That's one thing that seems to hold promise, because 60,000 crores and more have been given as guarantee, and 1,000 crore worth of guarantee has been invoked. Another thing that is of value for micro MSMEs is the co-lending scheme that is just starting. So that will do what Dr. Gangopadhyay was just saying. It will help people go, and it will help people, entrepreneurs as well as institutions, move very smoothly from one size to another without first getting into the barrier from SHG to individual, then within individual from small to micro to medium like that. So once the co-lending scheme takes off, the hope is that it might be a game changer, but it's too early to say.
Well, thank you, Smita. Since you were talking about schemes, I have to read out this little excerpt from an email that Ashok sent me 3 days ago, where he said the Oxford English Dictionary defines scheme as follows. In quotes, a plan for getting money or some other advantage for yourself, especially one that involves cheating other people. I think someone in the Indian civil service had a sense of humor and a good Oxford education and decided to call the first program a scheme because they either knew what's going to happen or they just had a sense of humor. And since then, we've lived in a world of schemes.
So that's the reason why we always say scheming, right? That's from where the word scheming comes, yes.
Exactly. So there's one more question, but it's about how to improve millet yields. And I request Mr. Guru, who's asked that question, to please direct that in some other panel, because we are not really, any of us are not great agricultural experts here. However, being a Mahajan, am an expert in financing. And while we are traditionally known as money lenders, but let me tell you, since we were talking about MSME and startups, giving loans to a startup is the best way to bankrupt both the lender and the borrower. The best startup scenarios have a 30% success rate. That means by definition, 70% of startups will fail. Yet startups require financing. So how do we ensure that if we have to do it by loans, and if say the lender borrows money at say 6% and needs to make a margin of at least 2%, so that is 6 plus 2, 8, and has transaction costs of 4%, that is 12, and if there is a failure rate of 70%, then the break-even interest rate is 82% per annum. So you immediately say, "To margin ki baat kar raha hai." But this is simple arithmetic. So, which is why banks, any sensible banker will think 1,000 times before giving money to a startup. So there's no point beating our bankers on the head. What we need, and which is missing not just in India but in the global financial architecture, is a new financial product called micro equity. We need equity financing, but at the lower end of the pyramid. And the way to do that is finance 10 micro enterprises. Assume 7 will fall by the wayside. The returns that you will get from the remaining 3 should be sufficient that you can continue to be in that business. And that you do through profit sharing. And since Subhashish talked about Dr. Ambedkar, well before him, there was something called Islamic finance from the 7th century AD, where these products are well established. They're called musharka and diminishing musharka. It's known as profit sharing. As you know, in Islam, giving money for interest is haram, but profit sharing is not haram. And the principle is that if you share in the...
I was being a nationalist, therefore I mentioned Ambedkar.
I'm also being a nationalist and an internationalist when I say that we can learn something from any tradition. So profit sharing is not haram. The principle is that if you're sharing in somebody's prosperity, you must also share in their adversity. Therefore, you do risk financing, which is called equity financing in modern terminology. We need a new financial product called micro equity. So that brings me to the end of this session, and I'd like each of you to take maybe 30 seconds to give one last message to our audience, and then I'll thank the organizers and the audience. Starting with Subhashish, yourself.
Well, I think since we started with creating job-full growth rather than jobless growth, I will have to say that yes, there are many things we can do for the current people in the labor force, or in the workforce, but I think we should focus more on the generation that is going to enter the workforce, and there, much better training, much better resourcefulness in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of ability to start businesses, in terms of financing and all of that. You talked about microequity. The only reason why it is not happening is because we don't have a legal framework for microequity. We do have it for venture capital, but we don't have it for microequity. So these are the nitty-gritty details instead of, building a huge, edifice around it. When we were growing up, we were always told that economists have their feet planted firmly 2 feet above the ground. I think we have to get rid of that approach.
Thank you so much. Ashok?
I think we've covered a very good part of the canvas. The important things that I think need collaboration, coordination between government, business, big business, and civil society is how to promote small businesses, mini businesses of the kind that I was talking about earlier, which create employment, deliver goods and services that everyone in the local community needs in a way that is financially viable. And that needs better technologies. It needs better financing systems. It needs majorly important linkages with the market and the supply side as well as the demand side. And in order to do that, I think government and big business have a role to play, and so does civil society. NGOs, volunteer organizations of the kind that are represented here, have a major role to play. And I think if there is going to be a future, it's going to be in green businesses. We've got to promote, and that is the key to getting equity. The equity that you mobilize from public funds needs to lead to public benefits. And the green enterprises are the ones that are likely to give that the most.
Smita?
Thank you.
I see Parul looking at me a bit worriedly, so very short.
One thing is we need to definitely focus on non-financial services, because that's something that's very, very important to growing businesses, especially women's businesses. But I do want to say that it's important to formalize women's work, whether it's the government sector or wherever. It's important to recognize their work as work and not as volunteers and honorary workers. It is important to work on ensuring that women get property, because unless women get property, they will not get access to either finance or entrepreneurship in terms of equal equity and equality. And finally, I think what's really, really important in this country is to teach men to do household work. Okay. Unless men are doing household work and unless care work and household work is being shared, this idea of feminized work, which will go directly into formal work, directly into entrepreneurship, will continue to make our livelihoods completely gender biased. Thank you.
Thank you. Parul, do I have 1 more minute? Yes. Okay. So no session with Mr. Mahajan ends, no session with VJ without a PJ. So here's my PJ. You've all heard of...
That itself was a PJ.
So, but Vipin knows, and despite that, he's invited me for 20 years. So I think he enjoys my PJs. But there he is. So we've all heard the Ashirwad, the blessing in Hindi, Jug Jug Jio. Well, for this session, I have a new blessing for this decade for our country, which is GGGO, but it is G and GEO. And that GGGO, Smita, you'll be happy to know, the first G is gendered, and Ashok, you'll be happy to know the second G is green, and Subhashish, you'll be happy to know the third G is Gen Next, the youth. So gendered, green, and Gen Next economic opportunities. GGGO. Thank you. With that, thank you for having this session. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Subhashish. Bye, Smita.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Parul.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this discussion.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, Vijay.
Parul, may I leave?
Absolutely, sir. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thank
Vijay.
you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Vipin.
Bye.
Very exciting session.
All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much for this. We'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll be ready for our next track. Thank you.